Welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to tell you all about functions and scopes. So what is a function? Well, if we start a blank sketch, you see something like this. You have two functions, the setup and the loop function. And the Arduino IDE already gives you some hints what to put where. Here you set your setup code, and basically it's setting inputs, outputs, initial state of motors, whatever. And the loop is repeating all over again for your main program. And what we can see here, these functions have the word void in front of it. Well, void means empty, so actually these functions return nothing. The return value is empty. So if I create my own function, which is, for example, add, I'll make it lowercase, and I give the function add two numbers, a and b, and what I'm going to do is return these numbers like this. So now I've created a function, and as you can see, I don't use void, I use integer. The reason for this is that I'm going to return with this return statement the number provided as a and b summed together. And this function is just continuously repeating and executing the stuff inside, but doesn't return a thing. So here I've defined two parameters. These parameters are values which we can give to the function. I basically create some kind of blueprint for the function. The nice thing about this is that a function is a kind of black box. You don't have to know what's inside of the function. So another developer could write this function, and you have to know that the blueprint for this function is that you have to give it two numbers. So if we want to use this function, we can here say add, let's say 1 and 10. So the result will be 11 because a will become 1, b will become 10. So we return here a plus b, which is 11. So now something interesting about scopes. This variable, a and b, only exists within this function, within the function add. So between this and this curly brace, the variable a and b will exist. If I here say int a is 10, well, now we make it different, we make it 23. So now I have here an int a and here an int a. But this a only exists inside the loop function between those curly braces. So this a is independent of this a. I can even in the setup make a different a variable, which is like 5, and it's also different. So each function has its own function scope where you can create variables. But what if I want a value which exists in all three of these functions? Well, then we have to find a higher scope, and in this case it's the global scope. You can set outside all the functions, you can say int x is 48, and now x exists in setup, in loop, and in add. So what we now can do is, I remove this line to make it easier, I can set here x, and x is 48, and we have 10. So here a is 48, oh, I get a comment, a is 48, and b is 10. So the value returned here is 58. So in this way you can define variables only to the scopes where you need it. Well, there is a recommendation that is you narrow your scope as much as possible. So even though I can set the x here in the global scope, it's very tending to use this all the time. But you will pollute memory, you will pollute your program, and what happens often if you have larger programs, you get lost of these global variables and it will interfere with your local variables. So in this example, I only use x here. So what I do is I remove it from here and put it inside the loop function, since that's the place where I only use it. Well, when you're creating an Arduino program, it can become very cluttered with a lot of code inside the loop. My recommendation is that you create functions, and functions which has a single purpose. So for example, I remove this one, I create a void which is called draw menu. Imagine we have an LCD screen or something, so here we say LCD draw and then whatever. And now I can here say draw menu inside the loop. If I want to read, for example, sensors, I can say, well, here we say void read sensors. And inside this function we read all the values of our sensors. So first I read the sensors and then I draw my menu. But what if we have multiple sensors? What we can do is say read sensor temp and, for example, read sensor humid for humidity. And the read sensor function calls read sensor temp. So what you can see is that you can call functions within functions within functions. And this helps you to structure your program, because in the main loop you only need to know that you read sensors. But inside that function here you can see which sensors you're going to read, and the actual reading is done in these functions. Let's remove this. So now you can basically structure your program. The nice thing is, if you change your temperature sensor, for example, then you only need to update this function. You don't need to touch the read sensor function. And that makes it simple and clean. And keep in mind that you create functions with a single purpose. And if it has a multiple purpose, try to split it up, because then you can structure things. Another nice thing is that if you have these functions and you are reusing them a lot, then you might want to create a library with all these functions. And that's basically what we do, for example, when we use an LCD. When we use an LCD, we connect to it and we initialize the LCD library and everything. Well, these are all functions which someone exposes in the library and you just call them. So for example, this LCD draw, which I just made up, but it could be an LCD library. Someone tells you the signature of the function, which parameters it expects, and it just works. And you don't have to worry about the inside of the function and how it exactly works, but the nice thing is you just call it and it does its thing. So I recommend to you to play around with these functions, make some basic functions for some mathematical operators or reading sensors, displaying output or whatever, and play around with the return value. So these are all void now, but also what I did before with the add, when I returned an integer. Try to play around with it a bit so you have a good understanding of the functions and their scopes. Also mess around with the scopes. Try making it as high as possible here on the top in the root scope. Say here int x is 500 and see for yourself in which functions the x will appear. Because the interesting thing is, here we have multiple levels. We have the global scope, and then we have the function scope, and here we have a function which calls other functions. So that's also really interesting, because if here I say int x is, what did I do? No, int b is x, now it gets interesting. Because I defined x over here, now I define b over here, which becomes x. So now within the scope of read sensor, b has become x. So b and x should be equal. So just play around, and if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments. I try to answer them as soon as I can. And then also we can learn from each other. And that's it for this episode. See you in the next one.